The Agony of Eros. Untimely Meditations 1. The Agony of Eros. Byung chul 2. On Hitler's Mein Kampf, The Poetics of National Socialism Albrecht Koschork 3. In the Swarm, Digital Prospects Byung chul 4. The Terror of Evidence Marcus Steinweg. Translated by Eric Butler. Foreword by Alain Badiou. Foreword, The Reinvention of Love. In this book, Byung chul bears witness to how love in the strong sense that a long historical tradition has granted it is threatened. Perhaps it is already dead, at any rate, it is gravely ill. Hence the title, The Agony of Eros. But whose blows have struck true love so low? The perpetrators are contemporary individualism, the effort to determine the market value of everything, and the set of monetary interests that now govern all conduct. In truth, love refuses to accept all such norms of the contemporary world, the world of globalized capitalism, because it is not a simple pact of pleasant coexistence between two individuals, rather it is the radical experience, perhaps to the outermost point, of the existence of the other. To demonstrate as much, the author offers a kind of phenomenology of true love, including sexual love, and tracks down, in their many forms, the threats it faces. On the one hand, this involves describing what occurs in the absolute experience of altruity, on the other, it means indicting, on an array of different registers, all that draws us away from such experience and even prevents us from seeing that it exists at all, or the consequences this circumstance brings. Implacably, Han argues that the minimum condition for true love is possessing sufficient courage to accept self-negation for the sake of discovering the other. At the same time, he provides an intensive survey of all the traps set for, and attacks perpetrated on, the very possibility of eros in a world that, as it stands, cares only for agreement, agreeability, and narcissistic gratification. This work proves utterly absorbing precisely because of its unlikely combination of philosophical rigor. It concludes with a striking quotation from Deleuze and Guattari, and a wealth of far-ranging sources. The first chapter enlists Lars von Trier's Melancholia, as well as Bruegel's The Hunters in the Snow and Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, both of which are featured in von Trier's film, to show how the disastrous eruption of pure exteriority, the wholly other, represents a catastrophe for the ordinary balance of the subject. By the same token, however, apparent disaster offers the good fortune of escape and absence from oneself, and ultimately shows the way to redemption. After a severe critique of Foucault, who is faulted for valorizing ability, power, in opposition to the passivity of knowledge, and therefore performance, the second chapter features a measured appreciation of Levinas and Buber, who discerned that, as Han puts it, eros is a relationship to the other situated beyond achievement, performance, and ken. What escapes Foucault entirely, and Levinas merely touches on, is, in fact, a central argument of the book, the negativity of otherness, that is, the atypia of the other, which eludes all ability, is constitutive of erotic experience. This striking formulation represents, as it were, the matrix of the work as a whole. Only by way of being able not to be able does the other appear. The experience of love, then, is shot through with powerlessness, the price to be paid for all revelation of the other. By way of a striking reading of Hegel, the third chapter identifies the power of love as a new measure of the absolute. There can be no absolute without absolute negativity. Only in love can spirit assume the experience of its own annihilation, that is, as Hegel puts it, preserve itself even in death, because, for the other to arrive, one must no longer be anything at all. In declaring as much, Hegel made brutally possible. Han quotes with delight the latter's terrible words: eroticism, it may be said, is ascending to life up to the point of death. The fourth chapter revisits the classic opposition between eroticism and pornography. Taking up Agamben and Baudrillard, and not without ample criticism, Han shows how pornography is nothing other than the profanation of eros. These pages include a brilliant appraisal of the culture and value of exhibition. Capitalism is aggravating the pornographication of society by making everything a commodity and putting it on display. Knowing no other use for sexuality, it profanes eros into porn. Love alone permits eroticism, or sex, to be ritualized instead of being put on show. Thereby is the mystery of the other which contemporary exhibitionism is degrading into a dull article for consumption preserved, even in nakedness. The fifth chapter takes the reader on a journey in the company of Eva Illouz, Why Love Hurts, Flaubert, Barthes, and others to explore how love so rich in varied fantasies about the other lies in the throes of agony because the contemporary universe of normalization and capitalization presents the inferno of the same at every turn. Hand's profound analysis shows how the barriers, borders, and exclusions that capitalism produces, especially between rich and poor, derive not so much from difference as from the identical. Money, as a matter of principle, makes everything the same. It levels essential differences. As configurations for shutting out and excluding, such borders abolish fantasies of the other. The sixth chapter reveals the connection between love and politics. Via a subtle discussion of Plato and his dynamic conception of the soul which love steers toward the idea, a marked contrast emerges to what Hahn calls burnout society, a remarkable coinage extremely well suited to our world today. The author offers a strong reading of my own thesis that love is a two-scene, a dual perspective and, by virtue of this fact, represents a kind of basic political matrix. The chapter concludes with love's transformative power. Eros manifests itself as the revolutionary yearning for an entirely different way of loving and another kind of society. Thereby, it maintains fidelity to what is yet to come. The final chapter affirms that love is necessary for thought to exist at all. To be able to think, one must first have been a friend, a lover. So concludes an encomium of love joined to a radical critique of a world that refuses it. To be dead to love is to be dead to thought. Though slim, this book is rich and rewarding, as sublime in its praise of altruity as it is unsparing in its critique of the modern subject's depressive narcissism, exhaustion, and individualism. Needless to say, it provokes further debate. To open just one avenue of discussion, is it absolutely certain that the only way to oppose a consumerist and contractual conception of altruity is to abolish the self, on a sublime and all but impossible scale, in order to encounter the other? Must absolute negativity be mustered to counter the crass positivity of repetitive, self-serving gratification? After all, the notion of amorous ablativity, the vanishing of the self in the other, has a long and glorious history, the mystical love of God, for example, as passionately described in the poems of Saint John of the Cross. Yet now, after the death of God, is it even necessary to continue down this path? Perhaps this leg of the journey has lasted long enough. Another road may stretch ahead, along the lines of a world beginning with the two of love. This world whose foundations lie in we two, singular, would belong neither to me nor to the other but would exist for all. Isn't there, metaphorically, a kind of ultra-leftism hiding in the unlimited and absolute assumption of the negative and altruity? Perhaps, in material terms, fidelity in love amounts to two combined instances of forgetting that come to work together in a way that admits universal validation for the sake of a shared reality. Whatever the case, this remarkable essay, an intellectual experience of the first order, affords one of the best ways to gain full awareness of and join in one of the most pressing struggles of our day, the defense, that is to say, as Rimbaud desired it, the reinvention, of love. Alain Badiou. The agony of eros. Melancholia. In recent years, the end of love has been announced many times. Love, the claim goes, is foundering because of endless freedom of choice, the overabundance of options, and the compulsion for perfection. In a world of unlimited possibilities, love itself represents an impossibility. Passion, too, is said to have grown cold. Eva Illouz has traced the state of affairs back to the rationalization of love and expanding technologies of choice. However, this sociological theory fails to recognize that another influence is now underway, which is corroding love far more than endless freedom or unlimited possibilities. The crisis of love does not derive from too many others so much as from the erosion of the other. This erosion is occurring in all spheres of life. Its corollary is the mounting narcissification of the self. In fact, the vanishing of the other is a dramatic process, even though, fatefully enough, it largely escapes notice. Eros concerns the other in the strong sense, namely, what cannot be encompassed by the regime of the ego. Therefore, in the inferno of the same, which contemporary society is increasingly becoming, erotic experience does not exist. Erotic experience presumes the asymmetry and exteriority of the other. It is not by chance that Socrates the lover is called adipose. The other, whom I desire and who fascinates me, is placeless. He or she is removed. From the language of sameness, being atopic, the other makes language indecisive. One cannot speak of the other, about the other. Every attribute is false, painful, erroneous, awkward. Our contemporary culture of constant comparison, vergleation, leaves no room for the negativity of what is adipose. We are constantly comparing one thing to another, thereby flattening them into the same, precisely because we no longer experience the atopia of the other. The negativity of the atopic other refuses consumption. Therefore, the society of the consumer endeavors to eliminate atopic otherness in favor of consumable heterotopic differences. In contrast to otherness, difference is positive. Yet today, negativity is disappearing everywhere. Everything is being flattened out into an object of consumption. Today, we live in an increasingly narcissistic society. Libido is primarily invested in one's own subjectivity. Narcissism is not the same as self-love. The subject of self-love draws a negative boundary between him or herself and the other. The narcissistic subject, on the other hand, never manages to set any clear boundaries. In consequence, the border between the narcissist and the other becomes blurry. The world appears only as adumbrations of the narcissist's self, which is incapable of recognizing the other in his or her otherness, much less acknowledging this otherness for what it is. Meaning can exist for the narcissistic self only when it somehow catches sight of itself. It wallows in its own shadow everywhere until it drowns in itself. Depression is a narcissistic malady. It derives from overwrought, pathologically distorted self-reference. The narcissistic depressive subject has exhausted itself and worn itself down. Without a world to inhabit, it has been abandoned by the other. Eros and depression are opposites. Eros pulls the subject out of itself, toward the other. Depression, in contrast, plunges the subject into itself. Today's narcissistic achievement subject seeks out success above all. Finding success validates the one through the other. Thereby, the other is robbed of otherness and degrades into a mirror of the one, a mirror affirming the latter's image. This logic of recognition ensnares the narcissistic achievement subject more deeply in the ego. The corollary is success-induced depression. The depressive achievement subject sinks into, and suffocates in, itself. Eros, in contrast, makes possible experience of the other's otherness, which leads the one out of a narcissistic inferno. It sets into motion freely willed self-renunciation, freely willed self-evacuation. A singular process of weakening lays hold of the subject of love which, however, is accompanied by a feeling of strength. This feeling is not the achievement of the one, but the gift of the other. In the inferno of the same, the arrival of the atopic other can assume apocalyptic form. In other words, today, only an apocalypse can liberate, indeed, redeem us from the inferno of the same, and lead us toward the other. Thus, Lars von Trier's Melancholia begins with the announcement of an apocalyptic, disastrous event. Disaster literally means unlucky star, disastrum, in Latin. On her sister's estate, Justine stares into the night sky and sees a reddish glow, which later proves to be a starless planet headed for Earth. This heavenly body, Melancholia, is a disastrum, which sets fatality in motion. At the same time, however, it is a negative, emanating a healing, cleansing effect. The name Melancholia is paradoxical insofar as this planet heals the depression that has taken the shape of a particular form of melancholy. It manifests itself as the atopic other, which tears Justine out of the swamp of narcissism. She experiences a veritable blossoming under the influence of the death-bringing planet. Eros conquers depression. The tense relationship between love and depression commands the cinematic discourse of Melancholia from the film's inception. The prelude from Tristan und Isolde, which frames the film musically, invokes the power of love. Depression represents the impossibility of love. Alternatively, it is the impossibility of love that has led to depression. Only the planet Melancholia, the atopic other breaking into the inferno of the same, arouses erotic desire in Justine. The nude scene, at the rocks on the river's edge, presents the body of a lover, aglow with sensuality. Eagerly, Justine writhes in the blue light of the heavenly body that is bringing death. The scene intimates that Justine in fact desires deadly collision with the atopic, wandering planet. She awaits approaching catastrophe as joyous union with her beloved. Inevitably, Isolde's Liebestod comes to mind. As death draws near, Isolde also yields lustfully to the world breathes wafting universe, de weltatems wehendem all. To it is no coincidence that precisely the scene, the only erotic sequence in the entire film, features the prelude from Tristan und Isolde again. Magically, it invokes the proximity of Eros and death, apocalypse and deliverance. Paradoxically, the approach of death animates Justine. It opens her to the other. Liberated from narcissistic captivity, Justine also devotes caring attention to her sister and her sister's son. The film's real magic lies in Justine's miraculous transformation from a depressive into a lover. Thus the atopia of the other turns out to be the utopia of Eros. Cannily, the director uses well-known classical paintings to steer the film discursively and reinforce a particular symbolism. Thus, in the surrealistic opening sequence, he fades in Peter Bruegel's The Hunters in the Snow to induce deep, wintry melancholy in the viewer. In the background, the landscape borders the water like Claire's estate, which blends into Bruegel's painting. Both scenes display a similar topology, as the wintry melancholy of Hunters in the Snow extends to the world of the characters. The hunters trudge homeward, downcast and in dark attire. The blackbirds in the trees make the winter landscape even gloomier. The sign of the inn, displaying the image of a saint, hangs at an angle and is almost falling down. Then, black flakes fall slowly from the sky, consuming the picture like a fire. This melancholy winter landscape is followed by a scene that resembles a painting. Here, Justine is presented in the style of John Everett Millais, with a wreath of flowers in hand. She floats on the water like the lovely Ophelia. After an argument with Claire, Justine succumbs to despair once more. Her helpless gaze wanders over abstract paintings by Malevich in books lying open on a shelf. In a fit of rage, she tears the books down, then replaces them with other pictures portraying unfathomable human passions. Just at this moment, the prelude from Tristan und Isolde sounds forth again. Once more, it is a matter of love, desire, and death. The first image Justine reaches for is Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow. Then she grabs a volume of Millais with the painting of Ophelia, followed by Caravaggio's David with the head of Goliath, Bruegel's The Land of Cocken, and, finally, a drawing by Carl Friedrich Hill depicting a forlorn, baying stag. The lovely Ophelia drifting in the water with her mouth half open, her gaze lost in the beyond, like a saint or a lover, points to the proximity of Eros and death yet again. Hamlet's beloved dies surrounded by fallen flowers, singing like a siren, Shakespeare writes. Ophelia dies a beautiful death, a Liebestod. Millet's painting shows a flower that Shakespeare does not mention, a red poppy, which signifies Eros, dreams, and intoxication. Caravaggio's David with the head of Goliath is also an image of death and desire. In contrast, Bruegel's Land of Cocken depicts an overstuffed society of positivity, an inferno of the same. Here, the swollen figures lie about apathetically, exhausted by satiety. Even the cactus has no thorns, it is made of bread. Everything is positive inasmuch as it is edible and consumable. This gorged company resembles the morbid wedding party earlier in the film. Tellingly, Justine places Bruegel's Land of Cocken next to an illustration by William Blake, which depicts a slave suspended by the ribs, but still alive. Here, the invisible violence of positivity stands opposed to the brutal power of negativity, which exploits and robs. Justine leaves the library immediately after opening a book to Hill's picture of the stag and placing it on the shelf. The image stands for the erotic desire, or yearning for love, that she feels. Clearly, Lars von Trier knew that Carl Friedrich Hill suffered from psychosis and depression. This sequence of images illustrates the discourse of the film as a whole. Eros, erotic desire, conquers depression. It delivers us from the inferno of the same to the atopia, indeed the utopia, of the wholly other. In Melancholia, the apocalyptic sky resembles the empty firmament that Maurice Blancat makes the primal scene of his childhood. It reveals the atopia of the wholly other by suddenly interrupting the same. Suppose this: the child is he 7 years old, or 8 perhaps, standing by the window, drawing the curtain and, through the pane, looking. What happens then? The sky, the same sky, suddenly open, absolutely black and absolutely empty, revealing such an absence that all has since always and forevermore been lost, the vertiginous knowledge that nothing is what there is, and first of all nothing beyond. The unexpected is the feeling of happiness that straightway submerges the child, the ravaging joy to which he can bear witness only by tears, an endless flood of tears. He says nothing. He will live henceforth in the secret. He will weep no more. 3. The child Blancat describes is enraptured by the infinity of the barren sky, torn out of himself and emptied, interlinked, into an atopic outside, dissolved and drained. The disastrous event, Aranis, this invasion of the exterior and wholly other, unfolds as dispossession, antiness, and annulment and voiding of the own, that is, it unfolds as death, the sky's emptiness, the disaster as withdrawal outside the sidereal abode. 4. And yet, disaster fills the child with ravaging joy indeed, with the happiness of absence. Herein lies the dialectic of the disaster, which also structures Melancholia. Catastrophic fatality abruptly switches over into salvation. Being able not to be able. Achievement society is wholly dominated by the modal verb can, in contrast to disciplinary society, which issues prohibitions and deploys should. After a certain point of productivity, should reaches a limit. To increase productivity, it is replaced by can. The call for motivation, initiative, and projects exploits more effectively than whips and commands. As an entrepreneur of the self, the achievement subject is free insofar as he or she is not subjugated to a commanding and exploiting other. However, the subject is still not really free because he or she now engages in self-exploitation and does so of his or her own free will. The exploiter is the exploited. The achievement subject is perpetrator and victim in one. Auto-exploitation proves much more efficient than allo-exploitation because it is accompanied by a feeling of liberty. This makes possible exploitation without domination. Foucault observes that neoliberal Homo economicus does not inhabit disciplinary society. An entrepreneur of the self is no longer a disciplinary subject one, but he fails to notice that this entrepreneur of the self is not truly free. Homo economicus only thinks himself free when in fact he is exploiting himself. Foucault adopts a positive attitude toward neoliberalism. Uncritically, he assumes that the neoliberal regime, the system of the least state or frugal government, which stands for the management of freedom to enable civil liberty, burger-like Freiheit. Foucault fails to notice the structure of violence and coercion underwriting the neoliberal dictum of freedom. Consequently, he interprets it as the freedom to be free. I am going to produce what you need to be free. I am going to see to it that you are free to be free. 3. The neoliberal dictum of freedom finds expression in the paradoxical imperative, be free. But this plunges the achievement subject into depression and exhaustion. Even though Foucault's ethics of the self stands opposed to political repression and allo-exploitation in general, it is blind to the violence of the freedom that underlies auto-exploitation. You can produces massive compulsion, on which the achievement subject dashes him or herself to pieces. Because it appears as freedom, self-generated compulsion is not recognized as such. You can exercise even greater constraint than you should. Auto-compulsion proves more fatal than allo-compulsion, because there is no way to resist oneself. The neoliberal regime conceals its compulsive structure behind the seeming freedom of the single individual, who no longer understands him or herself as a subjugated subject, subject to, but as a project in the process of realizing itself, Entwerfendes project. That is its ruse. Now, whoever fails is at fault and personally bears the guilt. No one else can be made responsible for failure. Nor is there any possibility for pardon, relief, or atonement. In this way, not only a crisis of debt occurs, a crisis of gratification does, as well. Relief from debt, financial and psychological, and gratification both presume the other. Lack of a binding connection to the other is the transcendental condition for crises of gratification and debt. Such crises make it plain that capitalism, counter to widespread belief, example Benjamin, is not a religion. Every religion operates with both debt, guilt, and relief, pardon. But capitalism only works with debt and default. It offers no possibility for atonement, which would free the debtor from liability. The impossibility of mitigation and atonement also accounts for the achievement subject's depression. Together with burnout, depression represents an unredeemable failure of ability, that is, it amounts to psychic insolvency. Literally, insolvency, from the Latin solvere, signifies the impossibility of paying off a debt. Eros is a relationship to the other situated beyond achievement, performance, and ability. Being able not to be able, nicht können, represents its negative counterpart. The negativity of otherness, that is, the atopia of the other, which eludes all ability, is constitutive of erotic experience. The other bears altérité as an essence. And this is why we have sought this altérité in the absolutely original relationship of eros, a relationship that is impossible to translate into powers. For absolutizing ability is precisely what annihilates the other. A successful relationship with the other finds expression as a kind of failure. Only by way of being able not to be able does the other appear. Can this relationship with the other through eros be characterized as a failure? Once again, the answer is yes, if one adopts the terminology of current descriptions, if one wants to characterize the erotic by grasping, possessing, or knowing. But there is nothing of all this, or the failure of all this, in eros. If one could possess, grasp, and know the other, it would not be other. Possessing, knowing, and grasping are synonyms of power. 5. Today, love is being positivized into sexuality, and, by the same token, subjected to a commandment to perform. Sex means achievement and performance. And sexiness represents capital to be increased. The body with its display value has become a commodity. At the same time, the other is being sexualized into an object for procuring arousal. When otherness is stripped from the other, one cannot love, one can only consume. To this extent, the other is no longer a person. Instead, he or she has been fragmented into sexual part objects. There is no such thing as a sexual personality. When the other is perceived as a sexual object, primal distance, distance, erodes. Martin Buber claims that such distance serves as the very principle of being human and constitutes the transcendental condition for any altérité existing at all. 6. Primal distantiation prevents the other from being reified into an object, an it. The other as sexual object is no longer a thou. It is impossible to have a relationship with it. Primal distance brings forth the transcendental dignity and propriety that frees, that is, distances the other into his or her otherness. Precisely this is what makes it possible to address the other properly. 1. Can call up, or out to, a sex object, but one cannot address it. A sex object also has no countenance, which is what constitutes alterity, the otherness of the other commands distance. Today, more and more, dignity, decency, and propriety matters of maintaining distance are disappearing. That is, the ability to experience the other in terms of his or her otherness is being lost. By means of social media, we seek to bring the other as near as possible, to close any distance between ourselves and him or her, to create proximity. But this does not mean that we have more of the other, instead, we are making the other disappear. Nearness is negative insofar as remoteness is inscribed within it. But now, a total abolition of remoteness is underway. This does not produce nearness so much as it abolishes it. Instead of closeness, it entails crowding. Nearness acts negatively. Therefore, it is inhabited by tension. In contrast, crowding acts positively. The power of negativity lies in the fact that things are enlivened precisely by their opposite. Mere positivity lacks any such power to animate. Today, love is being positivized into a formula for enjoyment. Above all, love is supposed to generate pleasant feelings. It no longer represents plot, narration, or drama, only inconsequential emotion and arousal. It is free from the negativity of injury, assault, or crashing. To fall, in love, would already be too negative. Yet it is precisely such negativity that constitutes love. Love is not a possibility, is not due to our initiative, is without reason, it invades and wounds us. 7. Achievement society, which is dominated by ability, and where everything is possible and everything occurs as an initiative and a project, has no access to love as something that wounds or incites passion. The performance principle that dominates all spheres of life today also encompasses love and sexuality. Thus, the heroine of the best-selling novel 50 Shades of Grey is surprised when her partner construes their relationship as a job offer. It has set hours, a job description, and a rather harsh grievance procedure. 8. The performance principle cannot accommodate the negativity of excess and transgression. Accordingly, the agreements the submissive pledges to observe include plenty of exercise, healthy meals, and ample rest. She is not allowed to eat anything other than fruit between meals. She must avoid immoderate consumption of alcohol and may not smoke or use drugs. Even sexuality bows to the commandment of health. Every form of negativity is prohibited. The list of forbidden activities includes using excrement, as well. Even the negativity of real or symbolic dirt is eliminated. Thus, the heroine signs on to keep herself clean and shaved and slash or waxed at all times. 9. The sadomasochistic practices the novel describes amount to nothing more than sexual diversions. They lack the negativity of overstepping such as occurs in Georges Baudelai's erotics of transgression. Thus, the partners determine in advance that they will not exceed hard limits. So-called safe words guarantee that activities do not go beyond certain boundaries. The overuse of the adjective delicious throughout the novel points to the dictate of positivity, which transforms everything into a formula for enjoyment and consumption. Even torture can be delicious in 50 Shades of Grey. This world of positivity admits only things that can be consumed. Pain itself is supposed to be enjoyable. Here, negativity which manifests itself as pain in Hegel no longer exists at all. The present that stands at one's disposal is the temporality of the same. In contrast, the future lies open to the event, which is absolutely surprising. Our relationship to futurity concerns the atopic other, which cannot be assimilated into the language of the same. Today, the future is shedding the negativity of the other and positivizing itself into an optimized present that excludes all disaster. And the musealization of what has been is destroying the past. As a repeatable present, this museum casts off the negativity of the irretrievable. Memory is not an organ of simple restitution, by means of which one makes the past present again. In memory, what has been is constantly changing. It is a progressive, living, narrative process. 10. In this, it differs from data storage. Technological data storage strips all life from what has been. It is without time. Thus, a total present prevails today. It is abolishing the irretrievable moment. Time without moments is merely additive and no longer situative. As the temporality of the click, it lacks decision and resolve. The blink of an eye is yielding to pointing and clicking. Erotic desire is tied to a particular absence of the other, not the absence of nothingness, but rather absence in a horizon of the future. 11. The future is the time of the other. The totalization of the present as the time of the same eliminates the absence that otherwise makes the other unattainable. Levinas interprets the caress and pleasure as figures of erotic desire. The negativity of absence is essential to both. The caress is a game with something slipping away. 12. It reaches for what is vanishing into the future without end. Its desire is nourished by what doesn't yet exist. The absence of the other in the midst of shared sensuality is also what constitutes the depth and intensity of pleasure. Today, love, which now means nothing more than need, satisfaction, and enjoyment, is incompatible with the withdrawal and delay of the other. Society, as a search engine, a machine for consumption, is abolishing the desire for what is absent, what cannot be found, seized, and consumed. Yet eros awakens only in view of the countenance that at once gives and conceals the other. 13. The countenance stands diametrically opposed to the face that holds no secrets, which exhibits itself in pornographic nakedness and hands itself over to total visibility and consumption. Although Levinas does not glimpse the erotic abysses that find expression as excess and madness, his ethics of eros points unambiguously to the negativity of the other, sacrosanct, atopic otherness, which, in today's increasingly narcissistic society, is vanishing. Moreover, Levinas's ethics of eros can be reformulated as resistance to the economic reification of the other. Otherness is not consumable difference. Capitalism is eliminating otherness wholesale in order to subordinate everything to consumption. Eros, however, represents an asymmetrical relationship to the other. As such, it interrupts the exchange rate. Otherness admits no bookkeeping. It does not appear in the balance of debt and credit. Bare life. The boar whose tusks killed Adonis embodies eroticism, which finds expression as madness and excess. After Adonis's death, the boar is said to have protested that it had not meant to injure the beautiful youth with its eroticized teeth, erotikos odontas, only to caress him. In his commentary on Plato's Symposium, Marsilio Ficino describes the eroticized eye, eroticonoma, of lovers. One like the boar's tusks, such a gaze is commanded by a deadly passion, for those eyes of yours, gliding through my eyes to the depths of my heart, stir the hottest fire in my marrow. Therefore, have mercy on me, who die because of you. 2. Here, blood serves as the medium of erotic communication. A kind of transfusion occurs between the eyes of the lover and the beloved. Put before your eyes, I pray, Phaedrus the Merinasian and that Theban who was captivated by love for him, the orator Lysias. Lysias stares open-mouthed at the face of Phaedrus. Phaedrus sends into the eyes of Lysias the sparks of his own eyes, and with the sparks sends along a spirit. The light of Phaedrus is easily joined by the light of Lysias, and the spirit also easily joins his spirit. The vapor of the sort springing from the heart of Phaedrus immediately seeks the heart of Lysias. By the hardness of this heart it is made denser and returns to its former state, as the blood of Phaedrus, so that the blood of Phaedrus is not in the heart of Lysias, a truly remarkable phenomenon. 3. As conceived in antiquity, erotic communication is anything but contented. According to Ficino, love is the most serious disease of all, a change. It takes away from a man that which is his own and changes him into the nature of another. For such injury and transformation constitute its negativity. Today, through the increasing positivization and domestication of love, it is disappearing entirely. One stays the same and seeks only the confirmation of oneself in the other. In consuming the romantic utopia, Eva Illouz claims that love is now becoming feminized. Adjectives used to describe romantic love scenes: nice, intimate, quiet, peaceful, comfortable, sweet, gentle, and so on are extremely feminine. The prevailing image of romantic love makes men and women alike occupy a female sphere of sentiment. 5. But counter to Ilau's diagnosis, love is not simply being feminized. Rather, in the course of a positivization of all spheres of life, it is being domesticated into a consumer formula devoid of risk and daring, without excess or madness. All negativity, all negative feeling, is avoided. Passion and pain are giving way to pleasant feelings and inconsequential arousal. In the age of the quickie, the casual encounter, and sex as stress relief, sexuality is losing all negativity, too. The wholesale absence of negativity is degrading love into an object of consumption, a matter of hedonistic calculation. The desire for the other is giving way to the comfort of the same. The aim is to procure the comfortable and, ultimately, dull immanence of the wholly identical. Modern love lacks all transcendence and transgression. Hegel's dialectic of master and slave describes the battle for life and death. The party who emerges as master does not fear death. The desire for freedom, recognition, and sovereignty raises the master above concern for bare life. It is fear of dying that induces the future slave to subordinate himself to the other. Preferring servitude to the threat of death, the slave clings to bare life. Physical superiority does not determine the outcome of the struggle. Instead, what proves decisive is the ability to die, 6 or a capacity for death. Those who do not have freedom unto death, Freiheit zum Tod, do not risk their life. Instead of following through to the point of death, mit sich selbst bis auf den Tod zu gehen, they remain standing alone within death, and sich selbst innerhalb des Tods stehen. 7. The slave does not venture as far as death, and therefore becomes a vassal who labors. Work and bare life are closely related. Both constitute reactions to the negativity of death. Today, the defense of bare life is intensifying into the absolutization and fetishization of health. The modern-day slave prefers it to sovereignty and freedom. He or she resembles the last human beings Nietzsche describes, for whom health per se represents an absolute value. It is exalted and made the great goddess, one honors health. We invented happiness, say the last human beings, and they blink. 8. Where bare life is hallowed, theology gives way to therapy. Or therapy becomes theological. Death has no place in the chronicle of bare life's achievements. So long as one remains a slave and clings to bare life, one remains subordinate to the master. But your grinning death, the one that creeps up like a thief and yet comes as master, it is hated as much by the fighter as by the victor. 9. Eros as excess and transgression denies both work and bare life. Thus the slave, who holds fast to life and labors, proves incapable of erotic experience, of erotic desire. Today's achievement subject is equal to the Hegelian slave in all respects except for the fact that he does not work for the master, but rather exploits himself of his own volition. As an entrepreneur of the self, he is master and slave at once. The issue here concerns a fateful unity that Hegel did not consider in his dialectic of master and slave. The subject of auto-exploitation is just as unfree as the subject of allo-exploitation. If we understand the dialectic of master and slave as the history of freedom, there can be no talk of the end of history, for we are still far from being truly free. Following this logic, we are witnessing a stage of history when slave and master form a unit. It means that we are enslaved masters or slaves who think themselves masters, not free human beings who will achieve reality at the end of history. History, understood as the history of freedom, is not over, then. It would only be over if we were really free, if we were neither master nor slave, neither enslaved masters nor slaves who think themselves masters. Capitalism absolutizes bare life. Its telos is not the good life. Capitalism's compulsive accumulation and growth is specifically aimed against death, which counts as absolute loss. For Aristotle, merely accumulating capital merits scorn because it has no concern for the good life, only for bare life, so some people believe that this is the task of household management, and go on thinking that they should maintain their store of money or increase it without limit. The reason they are so disposed, however, is that they are preoccupied with living, not with living well. 10. The process of capitalization and production is assuming infinite dimensions by doing away with the teleology of the good life. Its motion forward is speeding up more and more by losing all sense of direction. This is how capitalism becomes obscene. Hegel is receptive to the other like no other thinker. Such a sensibility cannot be dismissed as an idiosyncrasy. One should read Hegel differently than, say, Derrida, Deleuze, or even Baudelais have done. According to their mode of reading, the absolute points to violence and totality. But for Hegel it represents love. Above all, in love, those phases are present, in its content, which we have cited as the fundamental essence of the absolute spirit, the reconciled return out of another into self. 11. Absolute means unrestricted. It is precisely the restricted spirit, or mind, Geist, that wants immediacy with itself and turns away from the other. In contrast, acknowledging the negativity of the other is what distinguishes absolute spirit. According to Hegel, the life of spirit is not bare life, which merely shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, rather, it is life that endures devastation and maintains itself in it. Spirit owes its liveliness specifically to the capacity for death. The absolute is not something positive, which closes its eyes. Rather, spirit looks the negative in the face and tarries with it. 12. It is absolute because it dares to venture into outermost negativity which it incorporates, or, more precisely, encloses within itself. Where the purely positive positivity to excess prevails, no spirit exists. The definition of the absolute, according to Hegel, is that it is the syllogistic inference. 13. The word for inference in German, Schluss, also means conclusion, from schließen, to close cf concludere, in Latin. Schluss is not a category of formal logic in this context. Hegel would call life itself a conclusion, in the sense of an end. It would amount to violence, the violent exclusion of the other. If it were restricted, bypassing the end, it would yield a short circuit, Kurzschluss. However, the absolute conclusion is long and slow, it is preceded by tarrying, abiding or dwelling. The dialectic itself is a movement of closing, opening, and closing again. The spirit would bleed to death from the wounds inflicted by the other's negativity, were it not capable of reaching a conclusion. Not every end amounts to violence. Peace is concluded. Friendship is an end unto itself. Love is an absolute end unto itself. It is absolute because it presupposes death, the surrender of the self. The true essence of love consists in giving up the consciousness of oneself, forgetting oneself in another self. 14. The consciousness of the Hegelian slave is restricted. The slave is incapable of admitting an absolute end because he cannot relinquish self-consciousness, that is, he has no ability to die, no capacity for death. As an absolute end, love passes through death. Although one dies in the other, this death is followed by a return to oneself. The reconciled return to oneself out of the other means anything but violent appropriation of the other. Wrongly, this has been declared the main figure of Hegelian thought. Rather it is the gift of the other preceded by the surrender, the giving up, of one's own self. The depressive narcissistic subject has no capacity for conclusion. Yet without a conclusion, everything dissolves and becomes a blur. It is not by chance that indecision, or inconclusiveness, Unentschlossenheit, the inability to arrive at a decision or finish anything, die Unfähigkeit zum Entschluss, constitutes a symptom of depression. Depression characterizes our age. Thanks to excessive openness and unlimitedness, the capacity to close and conclude has disappeared. The ability to die is vanishing, too, because no one can conclude his or her life. The achievement subject has no capacity for bringing things to an end, for concluding, even provisionally. The subject breaks down under the compulsion to perform and produce accomplishments over and over. Love means dying in the other for Marsilio Ficino, too. When you love me, and as I love you. I recover myself, lost in the first place by my own neglect of myself, in you, who preserve me. 15. When Ficino writes that the lover loses himself in another self and yet, in this same waning and oblivion, recovers and even possesses himself, this possession is the gift of the other. The priority of the other distinguishes the power of eros from the violence of Ares. When power is a relation of domination, I assert myself against and oppose the other by subjugating him or her to myself. In contrast, the power, mocked, of eros implies powerlessness and unconsciousness, unmocked. Instead of affirming myself, I lose myself in, or for, the other, who then writes me again. The ruler possesses others through himself, but the lover takes possession of himself through another, and the farther each of the lovers is from himself, the nearer he is to the other, and though he is dead in himself, he comes to life again in the other. 16. Bertoli begins his discussion of eroticism as follows: eroticism, it may be said, is ascending to life up to the point of death. 17. What is affirmed here is not bare life which flees the negativity of death. Instead, the impulse to live, heightened to the utmost and affirmed, approaches the impulse to die. Eros is the medium for intensifying life to the point of death. Indeed, although erotic activity is in the first place an exuberance of life, the object of this psychological quest, independent of any concern to reproduce life, is not alien to death. To give this paradox some semblance of justification, Bertoli refers to Sata: there is no better way to know death than to link it with some licentious image. 18. The negativity of death is essential to erotic experience. If love exists at all, it is, like death, within us. 19. Above all, death concerns the ego. The erotic life impulses overwhelm and dissolve its narcissistic and imaginary identity. Because of their negativity, they express themselves as death impulses. Death that puts an end to bare life is not the only death. Relinquishing the imaginary identity of the ego and suspending the symbolic order to which it owes its societal and social existence represents a weightier death than the end of bare life. The transition from the normal state to that of erotic desire presupposes a partial dissolution of the person as he exists in the realm of discontinuity. Eroticism always entails a breaking down of established patterns, the patterns, I repeat, of the regulated social order basic to our discontinuous mode of existence as defined and separate individuals. 20. Everyday life consists of discontinuities. Erotic experience opens the way to continuity of being which only death, as the end of the discontinuity of beings, can provide. 21. In a society where everyone is an entrepreneur of the self, the economy of survival reigns. It stands diametrically opposed to the non-economy of eros and death. Neoliberalism, with its uninhibited ego and achievement impulses, constitutes a social order from which eros has vanished entirely. The society of positivity, from which negativity has disappeared, is a society of bare life, which is dominated exclusively by the concern to make sure of survival. 22. In the face of discontinuity, this is a slave's life. Concern for bare life, for survival alone, strips life of all vitality, which is in fact a very complex phenomenon. Whatever is merely positive is lifeless. Negativity is essential to vitality. Something is alive, only to the extent that it contains contradiction within itself. Indeed, its force is this, to hold and endure contradiction within. 23. Thus, vitality differs from the vigor or fitness of bare life, which lacks all negativity. A survivor is like the undead, too dead to live, and too alive to die. The Flying Dutchman's ship manned by the undead, according to legend, offers an analogy to contemporary burnout society. The Dutchman, flying like an arrow without aim, without rest, without peace. 24. Is like today's exhausted and depressive achievement subject, whose freedom amounts to being condemned to perpetual self-exploitation. Capitalist production is aimless, too. It no longer has any concern for the good life. The Dutchman is undead, unable either to live or to die. Damned to journey eternally in the inferno of the same, he yearns for an apocalypse that would set him free from torment. Great day of judgment, nearing slow. When wilt thou dawn and chase my night? When comes it, that o'erwhelming blow, which strikes the world with crushing might? When all the dead are raised again, destruction I shall then attain. Ye worlds, your course continue not. 25. Likewise, the society of blind production and performance at whose mercy Senta stands is without eros or happiness. Hum, 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 good will be whirling. Gaily, gaily turn thee round. Spin, 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 the threads be twirling. Turn, good will, with humming sound. 26. Eros follows a wholly different logic. Senta suicide, which is also a libestad, stands diametrically opposed to the capitalist economy of production and performance. Her declaration of love is a promise, a form of decision and conclusion, Schlussform. It is absolute and, indeed, sublime, transcending the purely additive and accumulative operations of the capitalist economy. It brings forth a duration, a clearing, Heidegger would say, in time. Faithfulness is a form of decision and conclusion that introduces an eternity into time. It encloses the former within the latter. But love, the essence of which is fidelity, demonstrates how eternity can exist within the time span of life itself. Happiness, in a word. Yes, happiness is the proof that time can accommodate eternity. 27. Porn. Porn is a matter of bare life on display. The antagonist of eros, it annihilates even sexuality. In this respect, it is more effective than morality. Sexuality does not fade into sublimation, repression, and morality, but fades much more surely into the more sexual than sex, porn. 1. Pornography derives its appeal from the anticipation of dead sex in living sexuality. 2. What is obscene about pornography is not an excess of sex, but the fact that it contains no sex at all. Today, sexuality is not threatened by that pure reason which puritanically avoids sex as something dirty. 3. But by pornography. Porn is not sex in virtual space. Today, even real sex is turning into porn. The pornographication of the world is unfolding as the profanation of the world. Porn profanes the erotic. Agamben's In Praise of Profanation fails to recognize this social process. Profanation means using things that have been set aside for the gods through consecration, sacrer, and stand removed from regular contact. It involves practicing a special form of negligence for with respect to what has been set apart in this manner. Hereby, Agamben adopts the thesis of secularization, assuming that every instance of setting apart has an authentically religious core. In this light, the museum represents a secularized form of the temple. Here, too, objects are placed at a remove and made unavailable for use. Likewise, Agamben considers tourism a secularized version of pilgrimage. Pious journeys from holy site to holy site correspond, today, to sightseers' restless trips through a world that has become one big museum. Agamben places profanation alongside secularization. What has been made to stand apart should be made available for use again. However, the examples of profanation he provides range from the tenuous to the outlandish. What could it mean to profane defecation? Certainly not to regain a supposed naturalness, or simply to enjoy it as a perverse transgression, which is still better than nothing. Rather, it is a matter of archaeologically arriving at defecation as a field of polar tensions between nature and culture, private and public, singular and common. That is, to learn a new use for feces, just as babies tried to do in their way, before repression and separation intervened. 5. Sada's libertine consuming a woman's excrement practices eroticism as transgression, in Baudelai's sense. But how can defecation be profaned beyond the threshold of transgression and renaturalization? Agamben's profanation is meant to suspend the repression that a theological, or moral, dispositive has cast over things. The example he finds in nature is a cat playing, the cat who plays with a ball of yarn as if it were a mouse, just as the child plays with ancient religious symbols or objects that once belonged to the economic sphere, knowingly uses the characteristic behaviors of predatory activity, in vain. These behaviors are not effaced, but, thanks to the substitution of the yarn for the mouse, deactivated and thus opened up for a new, possible use. 6. Agamben sees compulsion or constraint behind every purpose. The profanation he proposes would liberate things into means without ends. Agamben's thesis of secularization blinds him to the particularity of a phenomenon that can no longer be traced back to religious practice and even stands opposed to it. It may well be that in a museum objects stand at a remove, as they do in a temple. However, musealization and exhibition are precisely what destroy their cult value and replace it with exhibition value. Likewise, tourism and pilgrimage stand in opposition to each other. Tourism creates non-sites, whereas pilgrimage is tied to places. According to Heidegger, the quality that makes human dwelling, wohnen, possible is the divine. Such sites are constituted by history, memory, and identity. These same features are missing in the non-sites of tourism, where people pass by instead of lingering and spending time. Likewise, Agamben seeks to understand nakedness beyond the dispositive of theology, that is, beyond the prestige of grace and the chimeras of corrupt nature. 7. He claims that exhibition offers an excellent opportunity to profane nudity. It is this brazen-faced indifference that fashion models, porn stars, and others whose profession it is to show themselves must learn to acquire. They show nothing but the showing itself, that is, one's own absolute mediality. In this way, the face is loaded until it bursts with exhibition value. Yet, precisely through this nullification of expressivity, eroticism penetrates where it could have no place, the human face. Shown as a pure means beyond any concrete expressivity, it becomes available for a new use, a new form of erotic communication. 8. However, nudity that is displayed without secrecy or expression approaches pornographic bareness. What is more, the pornographic face says nothing. It has no expressivity or mystery, from one figure to the other, from seduction to love, then to desire, sexuality, finally to pure and simple porno. The farther you go, the closer you come to the lesser secret, the smaller enigma. 9. In contrast, the erotic is never free of secrecy. Contra Agamben, a face loaded with exhibition value to the point of bursting promises no new collective use of sexuality. 10. Indeed, exhibition destroys any and all possibilities for erotic communication. A naked face without mystery or expression reduced simply to being on display is obscene and pornographic. Capitalism is aggravating the pornographication of society by making everything a commodity and putting it on display. Knowing no other use for sexuality, it profanes eros into porn. On this score, Agamben's profanation amounts to just so much profanity. This profanation is unfolding as deritualization and desacralization. Today, ritual spaces and actions are disappearing. The world is becoming more naked and more obscene. Baudelaire's conception of holy eroticism still included ritualized communication, festivals and ceremonial games providing particularized sites, places at a remove. Today, love, inasmuch as it is supposed to amount only to warmth, intimacy, and pleasant arousal, points to the destruction of sacred eros. By the same token, pornography is eliminating erotic seduction, which toys with scenic illusion and deceptive appearances. Indeed, Baudrillard sets seduction in opposition to love. Ritual is in the realm of seduction. Love is born from the destruction of ritual forms, from their liberation. Its energy is an energy of the dissolution of these forms. 11. Pornography completes the deritualization of love. Agamben's profanation even promotes the deritualization and pornographication of the world in that it suspects ritual spaces of constituting compulsive forms of sequestration. Fantasy. In Why Love Hurts, Eva Illouz refers to the pre-modern imagination as information thin. Lack of information, she argues, leads to overvaluing one's love interest, to idealizing him or her and granting surplus value. Today, in contrast, the images we have are charged with information, because of digital communications technology, perspective imagination mediated by the Internet, can be said to stand in contrast to an information-thin imagination. Internet imagination is based on an accretion of attributes, rather than being holistic. In this particular configuration, people have too much information and seem less able to idealize. One allows also assumes that increasing choice entails the rationalization of desire. Desire, she argues, is no longer determined by the unconscious mind so much as by conscious selection. The subject of desire is made incessantly aware of and responsible for choice, for spelling out rationally desirable criteria in another. 2. Moreover, heightened imagination is supposed to have raised the thresholds of women's and men's expectations about the desirable attributes of a partner and/or about the prospects of shared life. 3. In consequence, one is now disappointed more often. And disappointment is a notorious handmaid of imagination. 4. Allows also examines connections between consumer culture, desire, and fantasy. Consumer culture is said to stimulate desire and the imagination. Images compete aggressively to be used, one gets lost in reverie as a result. Already in Madame Bovary, according to Allows, one can observe how consumerist and romantic desire reinforce each other. She points out just how much Emma's fantasy fuels her compulsion to consume. Today, in like fashion, the Internet is positioning the modern individual as a desiring subject, longing for experiences, daydreaming about objects or forms of life, and living experiences in an imaginary and virtual mode. 5. Increasingly, the modern self realizes its wishes and feelings in imaginary ways, through commodities and media images. Its imaginative faculty is determined by the market and mass culture. Allows traces Emma's dissipation to early consumer culture in 19th century France. Indeed, less customarily remarked in Emma Bovary's story are the ways in which her imagination is the engine driving the debts she incurs with l'heureuse, a wily merchant who sells her fabrics and trinkets. Emma's imagination feeds directly into the early consumer culture in 19th century precisely through the mediation of romantic desire. 6. Counter to Allows' assumption, however, Emma's behavior cannot be explained by the socio-economic structure of 19th century France. Instead, it finds expression as excess and expenditure, which represents a shift from what Baudeley would call restrictive economy to general economy. 7. Baudeley sets unproductive expenditure in opposition to forms of consumption that serve the means of production. 8. L'heureuse, who is said previously to have exercised the profession of money changer, stands for the bourgeois economy that Emma's unproductive, wasteful spending negates. Emma's behavior contradicts the economic principle of balanced accounts. 9. The logic of production and consumption. As the principle of loss, it renounces petty bourgeois happiness, which is precisely what the name l'heureuse means. Absolute loss is death. Thus, Emma's death represents a due consequence of the logic of expenditure and loss. Counter to what Allows assumes, desire is not rationalized today by increasing opportunities for, and criteria of, choice. Instead, unchecked freedom of choice is threatening to bring about the end of desire. Desire is always desire for the other. The negativity of privation and absence nourishes it. As the object of desire, the other escapes the positivity of choice. Today's ego, with its endless capacity to enunciate and refine criteria in mate selection, does not desire. To be sure, consumer culture is constantly producing new wants and needs by means of media images and narratives. But desire is something different from both wanting and needing. Allows does not take the libido-economical particularity of desire into account. Today's computerized high-definition imagery eliminates vagueness and ambiguity. Yet fantasy inhabits space that is undefined. Information and fantasy are opposing forces. Consequently, there is no such thing as an information-thick imagination incapable of idealizing the other. The construction of the other does not depend on whether more or less information is available. Only the negativity of withdrawal brings forth the other in its atopic otherness. It lends the other a higher plane of being beyond idealization or overvaluation. Information, as such, is positivity that leads to a dismantling of the other's negativity. It is not heightened fantasy, but if anything higher expectations that are responsible for the mounting disappointment experienced in contemporary society. Problematically, however, Illouz does not distinguish between fantasy and expectation in her sociology of disappointment. New communications media do not give flight to fantasy. Their high information density, especially in visual terms, does precisely the opposite, it stifles fantasy. Hypervisibility is not conducive to imagination. As such, pornography which maximizes visual information, as it were destroys erotic fantasy. Flaubert exploits the negativity of visual privation in order to rouse erotic fantasy. In a seeming paradox, the most erotic scene in Madame Bovary offers practically nothing to see. Leon seduces Emma to take a coach ride. The carriage drives aimlessly, without stopping, through the city. Behind the curtains, the couple indulges their passions. In elaborate detail, Flaubert names all the squares, bridges, and boulevards where the carriage wanders, the places it passes, Quatre Marais, Sotteville, the botanical gardens, and so on. But none of the lovers' activities is depicted. At the end of the drifting, erotic journey, Emma stretches her hand out the carriage window and scatters scraps of paper, which flutter like white butterflies in the wind and fall on a field of clover. In J.G. Ballard's short story The Gioconda of the Twilight Noon, the protagonist retreats to a house by the sea to recover his sight after falling ill. His temporary blindness heightens his other senses. From within, dream images well up. Soon, they seem more real to him than reality. Obsessively, he gives himself over to them. Time and again, he summons forth the mysterious coastal landscape with its blue cliffs. In his mind's eye, he clambers down rock stairs to a cave. There he meets a mysterious sorceress, the embodiment of his desire. After a beam of light strikes his eye as his bandages are being changed, he comes to believe that it has burned away his fantastic visions. His sight returns, but the dream images do not. Filled with despair, he resolves to destroy his eyes in order to see more. His scream of pain is also a joyous ejaculation. Quickly Maitland pushed back the branches of the willows and walked down onto the bank. A moment later, Judith heard his shout above the cries of the gulls. The sound came half in pain and half in triumph, and she ran down to the trees uncertain whether he had injured himself or discovered something pleasing. Then she saw him standing on the bank, his head raised to the sunlight, the bright carmine on his cheeks and hands, an eager, unrepentant Oedipus. 11. In his reading, Slavoj Žižek assumes that Maitland's actions unfold in an idealist, Platonic dispositive. How are we to pass from ever-changing false material phenomenal reality to the true reality of ideas? What does it mean to go from the cave in which we can perceive only shadows to the daylight in which we can catch a glimpse of the sun? 12. Žižek mistakenly claims that Maitland stares into the sun hoping to view the scene in its entirety. 13. In truth, however, Maitland is following an anti-Platonic dispositive. By destroying his eyes, he has made bold to withdraw from the world of truth and hypervisibility, to retreat into the cave at twilight space of dreams and desire. The inner music of things sounds only when you close your eyes. Roland Barthes quotes Kafka in this context: we photograph things in order to drive them out of our minds. My stories are a way of shutting my eyes. 14. Today, faced with the sheer volume of hypervisible images, we can no longer shut our eyes. The rapid succession of images leaves no time to do so, either. Shutting your eyes is negativity, which does not pair well with the positivity and hyperactivity of contemporary acceleration society. Compulsive hypervigilance makes it hard to close your eyes. This also accounts for the achievement subject's nervous exhaustion. Lingering in contemplation is a form of closure, ist ein Schlussform. Indeed, closing your eyes visibly signifies as much. Perception can arrive at a conclusion only by way of peaceful contemplation. The corollary of hypervisibility is the dismantling of thresholds and borders. Hypervisibility is the telos of the Society of transparency. Space becomes transparent when it is smoothed out and leveled. Thresholds and transitions are zones of mystery and riddle here, the atopic other begins. When borders and thresholds vanish, fantasies of the other disappear too. Without the negativity of thresholds or threshold experiences, fantasy withers. The contemporary crisis in literature and the arts stems from a crisis of fantasy, the disappearance of the other. This is the agony of eros. The fences, or walls, that are being built today no longer stimulate fantasy, or fantasies, because they do not generate the other. Instead, they extend through the inferno of the same, which obeys only economic laws. As such, they separate the rich from the poor. Capital is what is drawing these new frontiers. Yet money, as a matter of principle, makes everything the same. It levels essential differences. As configurations for shutting out and excluding, such borders abolish fantasies of the other. They no longer constitute thresholds or transitions leading somewhere else. The politics of eros. Something universal one inhabits eros. When I contemplate a beautiful body, I am already on the way to beauty in itself. Eros rouses and spurs the soul, engendering and bringing to birth in the beautiful. To it emanates spiritual buoyancy. The eros-driven soul produces beautiful things and, above all, beautiful actions, which have a universal value. That is Plato's doctrine of eros. It is not simply, as commonly assumed, hostile to the senses or to pleasure. But if love is profaned into sexuality, as is happening today, the universal quality of eros vanishes. Eros guides the soul, according to Plato. It holds sway over all its parts: pleasure-based desire, epithumia, spiritedness or courage, thumos, and reason, logos. Each spiritual component has its own mode of enjoyment and interprets the beautiful in its own way. 3. Today, it seems that desire, epithumia, dominates the soul's experience of pleasure. For this reason, actions are rarely thumos-driven. Rage is thumotic, it radically breaks with convention and inaugurates a new state of affairs. But now it is increasingly yielding to annoyance, or dissatisfaction, which lacks the negativity of rupture and instead allows circumstances to persist. Moreover, without eros, logos is deteriorating into data-driven calculation, which is incapable of reckoning the event, the incalculable. Eros must not be confused with fleshly desire, epithumia. For it stands above both desire and thumos. Eros makes thumos bring forth beautiful deeds. Thumos, then, would be where eros and politics touch. However, contemporary politics, which lacks not only thumos, but eros as well, has degraded into mere work. Neoliberalism is depoliticizing society in general and not least of all, by replacing eros with sexuality and pornography. It is based on epithumia. In a burnout society of isolated, self-alienated achievement subjects, thumos is also withering away. Communal action we now proves impossible. To be sure, a politics of love will never exist. Politics remains antagonistic. However, political action occurs in a sphere that intersects with eros on manifold levels. Eros can be transformed politically. Love stories that unfold against the backdrop of political events point to this hidden connection. Even though Alain Badiou rejects a direct link between politics and love, he presumes a kind of secret resonance that arises between life lived wholly under the sign of a political idea and the intensity of love. They are like two musical instruments that are completely different in tone and volume, but which mysteriously converge when unified by a great musician in the same work. 5. Political action is mutual desire for another way of living, a more just world aligned with eros on every register. Eros represents a source of energy for political revolt and engagement. Love is a two-scene, a theater meant for a duo, to paraphrase Badiou. 6. Interrupting the isolated perspective of the one, it makes the world arise anew from the vantage point of the other, or difference. Love, as an experience and an encounter, is marked by the negativity of upheaval. It is clear that under the effect of a loving encounter, if I want to be really faithful to it, I must completely rework my ordinary way of living habit or my situation. 7. The event is a moment of truth. It introduces a new and entirely different way of being into the habit of habiter, the situation at hand. It gives rise to something that circumstances cannot account for. It interrupts the same in favor of the other. The essence of the event is the negativity of rupture, which allows something wholly other to begin. Eventfulness connects love with politics and art. They all command fidelity to the event. This transcendental fidelity may be understood as a universal quality of eros. The negativity of transformation or the wholly other is foreign to sexuality. The sexual object always remains self-identical. No event occurs for it, since a sexual object that can be consumed is not the other. It never calls me into question. Sexuality belongs to the order of the habitual, which reproduces the same. It is the love of the one for another one. It wholly lacks the negativity of the otherness that occupies the two scene. Pornography reinforces habituation, for it erases otherness altogether. Its consumer does not even have a sexual counterpart. As such, it occupies the one scene. The pornographic image emanates no resistance of the other or the real. It is neither upstanding nor distanced. What is pornographic is precisely the lack of contact and encounter with the other. Instead, autoerotic contact and auto-affection protect the ego from being touched or seized by the other. Consequently, pornography intensifies narcissification. In contrast, love as an event as a two-scene is dehabitualizing and denarcissifying. It generates a rupture, a hole in the order of the habitual and the same. A central concern of surrealism is the reinvention of love. The new definition of love represents an artistic, existential, and political gesture. Thus, André Breton ascribes a universal power to eros, the only art worthy of man and of space, the only one capable of leading him further than the stars, is eroticism. 8. For the surrealists, eros is the medium of a poetic revolution in language and existence. 9. It is exalted as the energetic source of renewal, which also feeds political action. Through its universal power, it combines the artistic, the existential, and the political. Eros manifests itself as the revolutionary yearning for an entirely different way of loving and another kind of society. Thereby, it remains faithful to what is yet to come. The end of theory. In a letter to his wife, Martin Heidegger wrote, "The other thing, inseparable in a different way from my love for you and from my thinking, is difficult to say. I call it eros, the oldest of the gods according to Parmenides. The beat of that god's wings moves me every time I take a substantial step in my thinking and venture onto untrodden paths. It moves me perhaps more powerfully and uncannily starker and unheimlicher than others when something long intuited is to be led across into the realm of the sayable and when what has been said must after all be left in solitude for a long time to come. To live up to this purely and yet retain what is ours, to follow the flight and yet return home safely, to accomplish both things as equally essential and pertinent, this is where I fail too easily and then either stray into pure sensuality blossy Sinnlichkeit or try to force the unforceable through sheer work blosses Arbeiten. One without seduction by the atopic other, which sparks erotic desire, thinking withers into mere work, which always reproduces the same. Calculating thought lacks the negativity of atopia. It is work on the positive. No negativity inspires disquiet or unrest in it. Heidegger speaks of the sheer or mere work into which thinking degrades when it is not driven by eros to venture down untrodden paths, into the incalculable. Thinking grows more powerful and uncannier when moved by the beating wings of eros, as it seeks to translate the wordless, atopic other into language. Calculating, data-driven thought utterly lacks the resistance offered by the atopic other. Without eros, thinking is merely repetitive and additive. Likewise, love without eros and the spiritual lift it provides deteriorates into mere sensuality. Sensuality and work belong to the same order. They both lack spirit and desire. Not long ago, Chris Anderson, the editor-in-chief of Wired, published a provocative article entitled "The End of Theory." In it, he claimed that the inconceivably large volumes of data now available have made theoretical models entirely superfluous. Today, companies like Google, which have grown up in an era of massively abundant data, don't have to settle for wrong models. Indeed, they don't have to settle for models at all. Instead, they analyze data for patterns of affinity or dependency. The hypothetical models of theory are to be replaced with the direct comparison of data. Correlation is more important than causality. Out with every theory of human behavior, from linguistics to sociology. Forget taxonomy, ontology, and psychology. Who knows why people do what they do? The point is they do it, and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. 3. Anderson's thesis rests on a weak and simplistic conception of theory. Theory offers more than a model or a hypothesis to be proven or disproven by means of experimentation. Strong theories such as Plato's doctrine of ideas or Hegel's phenomenology of spirit are not models that could be replaced by data analysis. They are founded on thinking in the emphatic sense. Theory represents an essential decision that causes the world to appear wholly different in a wholly different light. Theory is a primordial decision, which determines what counts and what does not, what is or should be, and what does not matter. As highly selective narration, it cuts a clearing of differentiation through untrodden terrain. There is no such thing as data-driven thinking. Only calculation is data-driven. The negativity of the incalculable is inscribed in thinking. As such, it is prior and superordinate to data, which means things given. Indeed, for thought, negativity is pre-existing and prescribed. The theory underlying thinking is a precept, guide, and parameter. It transcends the positivity of given facts and makes them suddenly appear in a new light. This is not romanticism, but the logic of thinking itself, and it has been from the very beginning. Today, the volume of data and information, proliferating without end, is pulling science away from thought on a massive scale. Information is inherently positive. Data-based, positive science, Google science, which amounts to merely balancing out and comparing data, is putting an end to theory of the emphatic sort. It is additive or detective, not narrative or hermeneutic. No narrative tension animates it. As such, it falls apart into mere information. In view of the pullulating mass of information and data, theories are now more necessary than ever. Theories keep things from running together and sprawling. That is, they reduce entropy. Theory clarifies the world before it elucidates it. Consider that theories and ceremonies, i.e., rituals, share an origin. They confer form on the world. They shape the course of things, framing them so that they do not overflow. In contrast, today's mass of information is exercising a deformative effect. Massive information massively heightens the entropy of the world, it raises the level of noise. Thinking demands calm. Thinking is an expedition into quietness. The crisis in theory corresponds to a crisis in literature and art. Michel Butor, the representative of the Nouveau Roman in France, sees it as a spiritual crisis. We're not just living in an economic crisis, we're also living in a literary crisis. European literature is threatened. What we're now experiencing in Europe is a crisis of the spirit. For when asked how one may recognize as much, Butor responds, for the last 10 or 20 years, almost nothing has been happening in literature. There's a tide of publications, but an intellectual standstill. The reason is a crisis of communication. The new means of communication are remarkable, but they cause tremendous noise. 5. Rampant, massive information and excess of positivity makes a racket. Today's society of transparency and information has an extremely high noise level. But without negativity, only the same exists. Spirit, which originally meant unrest, owes its spiritedness, its animacy, to negativity. Data-driven, positive science produces neither insight nor truth. Information is only cognized. But cognition is not yet recognition, that is, insight. Because of its positivity, it is additive and cumulative. As positivity, information changes nothing and announces nothing. It is utterly inconsequential. In contrast, insight is a negativity. It is exclusive, exquisite, and executive. An insight preceded by experience is capable of shaking up the status quo in its entirety and allowing something wholly other to begin. But excessive cognition prevents recognition from taking place. Our information society is a society of experience. Experiencing, or loveness, is also additive and cumulative. That is what distinguishes it from transformative experience, Erfahrung, which often occurs only once. Thus, information society has no access to the wholly other. It lacks eros, which transforms. Sexuality also represents a positive formula for experiencing love. Therefore it, too, is additive and cumulative. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates takes the stage as a seducer, beloved, and lover. Because of his singularity, he is called adipose. His speech, logos, unfurls as erotic seduction, too. That is why he is compared to the satyr Marsyas. As is well known, satyrs and Silenoi numbered among the companions of Dionysus. Socrates is said to be more admirable than the flute player Marsyas, because he seduces and intoxicates by means of words alone. Anyone who listens to him goes wild. Alcibiades says that when he listens to Socrates, his heart beats even more violently than the hearts of people seized by the Carabans dance. He is wounded by his speeches of wisdom, philosophia logon, as if a snake had bitten him. Socrates' discourses bring forth tears. Until now, attention has hardly been paid to the remarkable fact that at the very beginning of philosophy and theory, logos and eros entered into such an intimate relation. Logos is powerless without the force of eros. Alcibiades says that Pericles and other orators, in contrast to Socrates, say nothing that grips or unsettles him. Their words lack the erotic power of seduction. Eros leads and seduces, firite und verführite, thinking down untrodden paths, through the atopic other. The daimonic nature of Socratic discourse derives from the negativity of atopia. Yet it does not end in aporia. Counter to tradition, Plato made Poros the father of eros. Poros means way. Although thinking ventures onto uncharted terrain, it does not get lost there. Because of his parentage, eros shows the way. Philosophy is the translation of eros into logos. Heidegger follows Plato's theory of eros when he remarks that the beat of the god's wing touches him as soon as he makes a substantial step in his thinking and ventures onto untrodden paths. Eros is called philosophos, the friend of wisdom, in Plato. 6. The philosopher is a friend, a lover. Here, the lover is not an outward personality and empirical circumstance but a presence that is intrinsic to thought, a condition of possibility of thought itself, a living category, a transcendental lived reality. 7. Thinking, in the strong sense, begins with eros. To be able to think, one must first have been a friend, a lover. Without eros, thinking loses all vitality and turmoil, and becomes repetitive and reactive. Eros infuses thinking with desire for the atopic other. In What is Philosophy? Deleuze and Guattari extol eros as the transcendental condition for the possibility of thinking. What does friend mean when it becomes a condition for the exercise of thought? Or rather, are we not talking of the lover? Does not the friend reintroduce into thought a vital relationship with the other that was supposed to have been excluded from pure thought? 8.